I'd always been fascinated in comparative religion, I suppose you'd call it. And I examined in Julian the origins of Christianity and the splits within the church. And then I became very curious, well, what did all this come out of? And I was very conscious that there's nothing very available to American readers on other countries' histories, religions, ethical systems. So I suddenly figured out, after a great deal of reading, that in the 5th century BC, everything happened. It was a great explosion in the life of the human race. And suddenly you had in Athens, you had Socrates, and a series of great philosophers. You had Zoroaster, who was a near contemporary in Persia. And out of Zoroaster comes monotheism, out of which comes Judaism and Christianity and Islam. In India, you have the Buddha and Mahavira, who's the head of the Jains. And in China, you have my favorite, who's Confucius, who's an atheist. But he's an ethical teacher, he's an educator. Now, these systems in the 5th century BC were all simultaneous. So I figured out one man, had he lived to be 75, could have met all of them. Most unlikely, since people from Greece did not travel often to China. But I invented such a character, and indeed I make him, I think he's a grandson of Zoroaster. So he's very interested in creation. He has one question to ask: how did it all start? And each of them gives a characteristic answer or non-answer. And in the course of his life, he ends up in Athens as ambassador from the great king of Persia. And Pericles is very much alive, and Socrates is around. And so in the course of the book, you get to see China, Cathay as I call it, India, Iran, Persia, and Greece. And it's the sort of book I wish I had had to read when I was a kid, because it really gets you into these systems, and I hope rather painlessly. It's had a curious history. It's picked up quite a few devotees over the years, but the publisher hated it. All those strange names. Americans want books about people called Jim and Lucy. They don't want to hear about Mahavira and the Gautama. So Over the Dead Bodies of my publishers, it came out, and was immediately, to their astonishment, I think it was the #2 bestseller on the dreaded New York Times bestseller list, and it's always had a following. It's now about to come out again in paperback. But I came to a number of conclusions while writing it. I never start with a theme that I'm going to demonstrate. If I wanted to do that, I would become a very high-paid lawyer and take on very expensive cases. That's what lawyers do. You let your imagination rove. You learn as much as you can about the subject. As you learn it, you are, in a sense, passing it along to the reader. You find out a number of things. One, that in the 5th century BC, there's a simultaneous explosion in every part of the world that we know about. New religions, new ethical systems. It suddenly occurred to me, and Noam Chomsky had this reaction when he read it, and he doesn't particularly care for novels, but he did read it, and he liked it very much. And what he liked particularly was I was coming to a conclusion, which is implicit in the book, that the human race is like a child. It's a toddler, it goes around on all fours, it stands up, and at a certain point it matures, reproduces, and in time decays and dies. Well, suddenly in the 5th century, it's as though the human race, having toddled around and made a mess, suddenly pulls itself together and figures out that the earth goes around the sun, figures out all kinds of things that he had no way of doing before, but through the sciences which began to blossom, there's a new view of creation, many views of creation. And Chomsky was very drawn to that because that's very much like his own theory of linguistics, that everybody is born with the same potential for language. Some are more advanced than others, but you go through phases until you get to it. You are articulate. Well, then question, as I finish the book, where are we? If we are the child who got through the 5th century, a great moment, we're now in the 21st century, which looks like it's going to be a very, very bad moment for the human race. We're about to go back to nuclear reactors for our fuel energy supply in the United States. That is a great step backwards. So that was one sense, is that we are evolving, we are a species, we will flower, reproduce, and eventually we'll die out. What phase are we at now? Well, we have the means of killing ourselves, but that is not in creation. Then to the question of how did it all start, which is the question that I call him Cyrus Spitama. Cyrus for the great king of Persia, at whose court he was born. Spitama, because that is the family name of Zoroaster, and he is related to the Holy Family. And so Cyrus Spitama is, wherever he goes, he asks the same question. And Confucius is really the best. He was asked once, what happens to us when we die? Now, everybody in the religion business has an answer for that, to make you feel better. And Confucius said, why do you ask me about death, about which we know nothing? And you say nothing about life, which we have to know a lot more than we do, and we can know. He just sloughed it off. The only so-called religious leader who didn't bother with that. Alexander the Great, when he swept into India with his Greek army, he immediately summoned a Buddhist priest, and he asked the same question. How did the earth begin? The human race began, and they said, well, it was said, there was this enormous turtle, and it laid an egg, and there was another turtle, and then there was another egg, and another turtle, and Alexander said, stop it, it's nonsense. That's ridiculous. And the Buddhist priest said, well, ridiculous questions deserve ridiculous answers. Or as an old lady who believed in the turtle theory once said, they said, well, what's that turtle resting on? She said, look, it's nothing but turtles all the way down.
I love how the book goes through. He first meets the Buddha, and then Master Li, and then finally Confucius, who obviously makes, and you just started talking about Confucius, but if you can talk a bit more about him, particularly, he was an extraordinary historian.
Well, Confucius was primarily an educator, and he was very interested in education, and out of him came the system of educating all the poor kids in China, which was the strength of the Chinese civilization for a couple of thousand years. And if they ever get their act together, it'll still be Confucius, because he just said, we're not going to train the aristocrats. We're going to go from village to village and take every bright boy we can find. They did not train girls in those days, but we will collect them from everywhere so that we have the best minds at work. Although he was an atheist and had no interest in a sky god, he believed in religious ceremonies, of which they had inherited quite a few. And he said the ceremonies must be regularized, they must be perfected, because they're very old, they hold together our race, and they are the balance between the Middle Kingdom, which China regarded itself, and heaven. And to maintain a harmonious balance, the ceremonies must be correctly done. For instance, the emperor always stood to the north of the people, as required. And there he receives the mandate of heaven which is the entire focus of the universe, is on him as the father, the leader of his people. And they have some vague creation theories, which Confucius never took very seriously. But he was extremely interested in ethical life as well as education. And one young man asked him, Master Kung was his real name, said, Master Kung, if there were one precept, just one, by which someone should lead a good and ethical life, what would that be? And Confucius said, 5 centuries before Christ, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The hysteria I got from the Christian right when I wrote that he couldn't have said that. I said, oh good, thank heavens you told me. Don't read the Analects of Confucius, in which all of his sayings are written down, or all the ones that were collected then.
Just a little bit more on what was, you said Confucius an atheist, but talk more about what his theory of creation.
Well, on creation, there was they had folk stories, and they were animists, as the entire human race was when it started. It meant they worshipped trees, they worshipped a river, they worshipped a star, the sun, which is called animistic. They would project sort of a human personality upon a special tree. Then from that they would evolve into gods and so forth. Confucius had just skipped all that stage. He went straight to what he wanted to do. China had broken up into about a half dozen warring states during his time. There was no proper emperor. The mandate of heaven had been withdrawn. Confucius felt that unless he could train, particularly the out-of-work knights, there were 5 ranks of nobility, and the bottom one was procreating greatly, had no money, and were just going around making a lot of trouble. They were becoming thugs, and he started to educate them. And he said, until we can educate the people once again so that they understand the old ceremonies, they understand the rules by which a good life can be led, until they begin once again those ceremonies which keep heaven and earth in balance, we will have nothing but chaos, nothing but war. So he founded what was really a kind of political religious party using well-born young men who had no money and no occupation. And he just set up schools and started to train them. And suddenly there was a Confucian generation. And in due course, I always thought, and I got the feeling writing the book, that Confucius saw himself as the Son of Heaven, that the mandate of heaven had come to him. And if he could simply pull off a sufficient educational system with these out-of-work knights, he would become the emperor, and he would straighten out the state. It did not come to pass. He held office once. I think he was chief of police in one of the duchies. He never got farther than that. But within a generation or two, there was indeed a very fierce emperor who united all of China, who came from the section called Qin, hence China. And he turned out to be a total tyrant and murdered everybody in sight. So these stories do not always have happy endings, but out of it came the Confucian system of education, which kept China as a high civilization for 2,000 years, and the richest nation probably in the world, and the most advanced scientifically, so advanced that a lot of Confucian wisdom was, they invented gunpowder, which allegedly Marco Polo brought back to Italy and to Europe. Well, they used it for firecrackers, which was much more fun. They knew they could blow up cities with it. But by and large, the Confucians taught it's just as well we don't use these as weapons. We'll go back to the bow and arrow. It's nicer. Causes less damage. So that even their scientific advances, where we would use everything immediately to kill people, they said, no, this is not going to be useful to us.
I just wanted to talk briefly about Pythagoras. Well, the question would be, who first coined the word universe, and what did he mean by it?
Universe, well, it's a monotheistic concept. It was certainly one of the Greek philosophers. We certainly get it later in Aristotle, but I think it's very early. I'm only guessing, because if I've known, I've forgotten, but it seems to me like Parmenides, who came right across the Bay of Salerno there, and he lived and died there. Parmenides thought everything was a whole. Everything was connected with everything else. And for him, this totality was creation. And everything was part of the whole forever, which is arguably what Democritus and the atomists, as they call them, also thought. We're all nothing but floating atoms. Some of them assemble as a person, some as a tree. But if you broke us all down, we would just be swirling atoms, one pretty much like the other, which again gives you the idea of a unit or a universe. So the exact etymology, I don't know.
For Cyrus, there was only one subject worth pondering, and that was creation.
Well, Cyrus felt that if you could figure out how it began, you might have some idea of what it was and where it was. Ever since I first started to think, the first question I asked myself is, where are we? We call this a universe, but it was pretty clear to me then there was a lot more. It was plural, not singular. There was an awful lot going on out there. What's it placed in? We're told it's expanding. Into what? Where is it sitting? That's a question that you can have many sleepless nights over. I'm told that there are mathematicians in advanced calculus who can do a series of numbers which answers it, but I am innumerate.
What if Cyrus were to? Well, we have quantum physics and we have general relativity, and we're going for this so-called unified theory. What do you think Cyrus would make of the newest theories of creation if he were alive here tomorrow?
Well, he would probably see them all as games. That every generation played a different set of games. The games, in some sense, advance. I think he'd be more of a Confucian with applying the sciences 99% to warfare and to destruction. I think he would probably say this was counterproductive. What is the point of having mastered the atom to use it to blow up 2 Japanese cities that we're trying to surrender? A bit of history that we're not allowed to be taught in the schools, but that was the truth of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think he would be... he came to no conclusion in the course of his 75 years. He found Socrates something of a windbag. He admired Confucius because he was practical. He found the Buddha very enticing and, of course, paradoxical. One of the Buddha's many names is Tathagata, which means he who has come and gone and come again. The Buddha is and the Buddha is not. This is worthy of President Clinton. What is a pure Buddhist line, calculated to stop you dead in your tracks. Am I here or am I gone? For the Buddha, who was a good Hindu, he believed in reincarnation. Nirvana, the ultimate, was when you've completed your cycle of reincarnation and you were freed and you entered sunyata, which means shining nothingness. And you just became an atom floating around in some shining place without consciousness. He didn't stress that, but plainly that's what he meant. So the Buddha is extremely attractive, but if you're interested, as I think my Cyrus was, and as certainly as Confucius was, in organizing a state and educating people, then to tell everybody, well, you're not really here anyway, so whether you're buried or not doesn't make much difference. You're just evolving. And this whole cycle of creation, I took this on in a book called Kalki, which I brought up to date. And an American GI says, I am Kalki, which is the name, the last reincarnation of the Buddha. Actually, Vishnu, the 9th incarnation, was the Buddha. The 10th will be a white man called Kalki, and it'll be the end of the world, this cycle of creation. And it was a Hindu belief that you went through a cycle, thousands of years, you went through all sorts of developments, and then Kalki on his white horse appears as Shiva, which is destruction. And the entire world ends. And it starts over again. There is a certain monotony to the Hindu religion. And to overcome that monotony, the Buddha arrives, teaching something quite different. That you yourself can get yourself out of this cycle, this deadly cycle of birth and rebirth and reincarnation.
We'll stop at Kalki again. To which theory of creation now then does Gore Vidal?
Well, I have my days. I have Buddhist days when I think it probably isn't here at all, that we simply imagine it. Since we know the difference from one mind to another, one temperament to another, and actually we're all basically sort of uninteresting and basically very calculable. You can pretty much figure out anybody's reactions to almost anything. That arguably we're interchangeable. I often think of the human race as a form of a virus, a bacteria, which is constantly pullulating and increasing its numbers. And I think it's as easy not to be as it is to be. But then you have to lower your sights, and as long as you are, then you try to do the best you can with what you're presented with in the way of a society. Hence the need for Confucius. So in practical mood, I'm a Confucian. And in fanciful mood, I find the Buddha extremely consoling to be done with rebirth and reincarnation. Monotheism, of course, came along to destroy everything in sight with Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And, of course, you have to promise afterlives. You have to make one race superior to another. You have to make hierarchies. It's the deadliest form of religion. And I would say one thing, except for the possible exception of Zoroaster, you would have found all of the great figures of the 5th century BC would detest monotheism, one God. But it's so clear, everything is God. There's so much of him. Universe is simply a synonym for God if you want to believe in a deity. And if you don't want to believe in a deity, there's an awful lot of evidence to support you.
I've read, you say the virus and we're devouring our host. Is there any hope that we won't?
Well, look, this is a very, very minor planet and a slightly second-rate sun, which is aging. And the survival of the bacteria that we call the human race, which is eating up the planet, destroying the planet, for us, it's not we're wonderful for cockroaches, apparently. They're going to go on forever thanks to our efforts, but we won't. So we probably will end in time, and incalculable time. And but there are plenty more where we came from. I'm sure there are duplicates of us everywhere. I like the idea of parallel universes in the Smithsonian Institution. I have a couple going, and even worked out a way how you would get from one end to the other. Somebody experimented with it and almost went back in time. Eventually convinced himself he had. He hadn't, but he made the first step toward it. So I have in there a scene in which it's very important to stop the Second World War, which can only be done by stopping the First World War. And that can only be done by making sure Woodrow Wilson does not become president. So the boy who was the hero of the book and a lady friend go back into time, 1939, and just before Woodrow Wilson is about to be, he's governor of New Jersey, and he's about to be picked for Democratic candidate for president. And they go back and they find him on a vacation in New Jersey. And he's got a mistress in Bermuda. This is all true. And they blackmail him, and he doesn't run, and there's no First World War. There's a German-French war as usual, but we're not in it. That's done by going into an alternative universe. Since I don't think time travel as such would ever work, but you might find a universe sufficiently similar that if you affected events there, it could indeed have a leak over into the universe in which you are stuck. I always seem to have known about Julian, the apostate, as he was called, meaning somebody who had started his life as a Christian and gave it up and went back to, actually he wasn't a pagan, properly speaking, he was a Neoplatonist, but what had happened was the founder of his dynasty, Constantine the Great, family came from what is now Serbia. It was called Illyria in those days. And there was Constantine, who was succeeded by Constantius, who in turn was succeeded by Julian. A lot of fighting going on inside. Anyway, Constantine became a Christian and forced the religion on the entire Western world. Constantine had reunited the empire, which had been broken in half by Diocletian. So he put the two halves together, set himself up as sole emperor. He had no organization. Christians don't like to hear this, but the reason that the West became Christian, was for administrative purposes. The Roman Empire had broken down. Roads had broken down. Communications. The only organized group anywhere in the empire was the church. And the church was divided between Athanasius and Arius, between Roman Rite and Greek Rite. But it still had a formidable organization and roads and records and filing cabinets. Constantine saw that he had to govern this repaired empire with something, and he made a deal with the church. I will make you church universal. Everyone must be Christian or else. Meanwhile, you will help me because you've organized the empire into so many dioceses and you have all these travelers and means of communication. I'm going to take over your apparatus. So that was the trade-off. Then comes, he's succeeded by Constantius. Constantine becomes a great theologian. He can't keep away from religious conferences. The Trinity was sheer ecstasy for him to try and figure out what on earth that meant. One bishop at the synod where they thought up the Trinity, somebody said, I don't understand a word of it. And this other bishop said, there are some mysteries too great for us even to think about. Julian did think about it. He was a younger son in the family. His father was put to death by Constantine. Constantine's heir became his enemy, Constantius. Julian rebels. Julian has made Caesar in Gaul. That's this Augustus is the number one title, and Caesar is the number two title. So he lives in Paris, in fact, which is a rather nice note. Anyway, he goes into rebellion against Constantius, who dies in the middle of the campaign. Julian becomes emperor. What he does, he doesn't go after the Christians the way the Christians were going after everybody else. Christians were killing everybody in sight, including each other. Those who were on the Greek side of Christianity were murdering those on the Roman side, and vice versa. Julian was in favor of toleration, something unknown in monotheism, which of course is absolute. So for your own good, we have to burn you alive. And Julian put an end to that. He said every religion will have its own opportunity to develop as it wants to. There will be no state religion. So, in other words, he thought of the First Amendment, the American Constitution, long before there was a United States. This created such rage in the Christian establishment, both Greek and Roman, that they were out to get him. He had also turned into a very great general, and he'd had one of the greatest victories since Julius Caesar in Gaul, and he saved the West for the empire. Goes back home, back to the hometowns in Illyria, in Serbia, in the Balkans. Constantine dies. He goes to the new city of Constantinople, the city of Constantine, and has 3 years as emperor, in which he is the first philosopher king. And he allows anybody to insult him and anybody to argue with him if they're intelligent. He will defend his positions. But his tolerance was intolerable to monotheists. So he went to war with Persia, which was Parthia, which was a constant enemy. And on campaign, he was doing pretty well against the Parthians, but he was murdered by a Christian in battle. And then another emperor was chosen on the battlefield and got back to Constantinople. And the world once more was dominated by absolute Christianity. And if you disobeyed, if you were not a Christian or anti-Christian or a pagan, pagan comes from the Greek word for country folk. And the country folk didn't take well to Christianity. They liked the old gods. So it took a long, long time to de-paganize country folk and make them into Christians. The last tribe, of which much has been made to be Christianized in Europe, were the Germans, the Teutons. And I think it was very late, 3rd, 4th century, when they finally baptized them. They put them all, dunked them in a river. And the last of the tribes to hold out, the legend goes that they were sworn they would never kill anybody. That was part of being a Christian. Of course, they killed whomever they chose, but in theory, they had to take sort of an oath at baptism that they would, thou shalt not kill. So every last one of them held up his sword arm from the river so the river water wouldn't touch it. His arm would not be baptized. Hence the Nazi salute.
Julian, like Constantine, admitted that he had trouble looking in men's eyes. Why was that?
I'd forgotten that. It is reported that I wrote that Julian had a similar difficulty looking into people's eyes that Constantine had had. Whether this is true, I've long since forgotten. I'm miles from my research, but there's one interesting thing anthropologically. When I came to write Burr, the first thing that you learn about Thomas Jefferson is he was the shiftiest-eyed man anybody had ever met. Jefferson could never meet another person's gaze. And generally people think, well, he's being evasive. He thinks, he doesn't dare look somebody in the eye. Later on, anthropologists have determined that the predator never looks his victim in the eye. And you'll see it even with dogs and cats. If one is about to attack, he will first look away, then he'll attack. The one who's going to be the victim is just staring straight ahead at his killer. But the true predator looks away, and Thomas Jefferson was certainly a predator, and Constantine, and I suspect Julian were also fairly predatory.
Did Julian have a tragic flaw? If so, what was it?
He thought that he could civilize the Christians. I think that is as deep a flaw as you could have. In other words, that you could allow them to go on with this injunction from St. Paul to proselytize everyone on earth. And if they wouldn't convert, you kill them, if you had the power to kill them. He thought that they would behave like civilized people if they were left alone to preach to people and convince people. He didn't mind. He didn't know that they felt they had a mandate to kill anyone who disagreed with them, and they would do it by force. That was an underestimation of the Christian message.
There's a passage which we know that we may want to read when we do the readings, but it's about the tyrant. He laughed, Michael Julian laughed too, for I had soaked him as well. Then I was alarmed. In just this way monsters are born.
What's that about? I don't know.
When he's taking a bath and he splashes his...
It's with Oribasius.
Oribasius, yeah.
And then he apologizes.
And I guess the question that would be, how does power corrupt? And how does Julian resist this?
Well, Julian was born knowing about power since he was a member of the imperial family. And the imperial family was as busy killing each other off as it was killing its enemies. So he knew right off that he was living a dangerous life, precarious life, and that he was apt to be murdered at any time. And he was perfectly prepared to take care of his enemies, but he didn't go looking for trouble. And he was surprisingly unparanoid, as emperors go. Constantius, his predecessor, was just terrified of his own shadow. And I think Julian, being a reflective man, he knew history. He'd read about the 12 Caesars. Am I going to be just like them or not? Am I going to be like them or not? That's a question he must have put himself.
Also, the scene where Julian has his transformative experience, feeling unified with the sun. Could you describe that, Gore?
Well, I don't know. Is that at Elefsis?
Let me see.
Are you going to the sun?
Yeah. Let's do it.
Julian used, he dealt in symbols. Everybody interested in religion works with symbols, consciously or unconsciously. And for him, early on in my narrative, is his affinity for Helios, which is the Greek for sun. And he saw that as the center of his being, from which his strength came. And the sun, of course, is represented by Apollo in the Greek pantheon. But it wasn't really Apollo that he directed his attention to, but it was the blazing disk, which was the source of life. And he was in a great tradition, which goes back to Akhenaten in Egypt and continues here and there today.
I just wanted to go back to the power. I think it's Julian that says it is the prerequisite of power to invent its own past.
No, that's very nice, isn't it? Well, you have the advantage of me because I've forgotten all this, but Julian would certainly have discovered what any thoughtful emperor would, and even some unthoughtful ones, that history is yours to do with as you please once you have absolute power. You can change anything to anything. Look at Julius Caesar fixing his genealogical tree to prove that he's a descendant of the goddess Venus, or other Romans making they were descendant from the Trojans. I mean, they were constantly coming up with faked genealogies to show how far back they go. So he would see immediately the value of even a false genealogy if he felt it was symbolically correct, that he was heir to the sun, heir to Apollo, heir to the source of all life. Yes, he would play those games, but I think his nature was, as I get him, was not all that mystical. He was a Neoplatonist, which was a really gaga philosophy, that it was a spin-off of Plato himself. And there are a number of really extremely boring philosophers it produced, like Iamblichus and Theopompus. And he was just absorbed by them. He wasted so much time with them. And for those who really liked good literature, they rather deplored his taste in metaphysics. But that was his hobby.
A couple more. Julian writes this, and this is something else I've talked about, written about in palimpsest, but they say that to know oneself is to know that all there is human. But of course no one can ever know himself. Nothing human is finally calculable even to ourselves. So very strange.
Well, the Greeks had an injunction which was carved in the place of honor on the temple of Apollo at Delphi. Know thyself. Anytime the Greeks put up anything in marble, you know they were in doubt about it. It's the things that people don't say about themselves that are true. Know thyself is a wonderful injunction. It just simply meant none of us knows himself. And this is a good thing sort of to aim at and to realize that one person is probably more or less like another person. And the better we know about ourselves, the wiser we will be. But it's more of a cry than a declaration. Know thyself. However, out of it has come the great line in Western literature, best exemplified by Montaigne, who really did nothing but write and write and write about the classics, and as always, know thyself. He would have kidney stones, and before you know it, he had gone off into a study of the infinite, study of religion, study of Cicero. And then he'd get back to what medicine he was taking to dissolve the kidney stones. Well, that's know thyself, know thy kidney stones, know thy Cicero. It was trying to pull it all together in order to get a purchase on knowledge and reality.
Rome never tried to impose, this is a quote from the book, Rome never tried to impose any sort of worship upon the countries it conquered, and civilized, in fact, quite the contrary. Rome was eclectic. As a result, we have 100 important gods and 12 mysteries. If they had imposed their religion on the countries they conquered, would they have survived? Maybe?
Well, I think the success of the Roman Empire was they accepted whatever deities and also whatever royal families, unless they were subversive, that came their way. what they did impose was a legal system, and the legal system involved, instead of, as in the United States, a deeply religious country dedicated to the Bible, you must swear an oath on a Bible that you will tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God. The Romans imposed on every country over which they held sway. In the courtrooms, there would be an image of the emperor, and you would have to swear on the deity of the emperor that what you were about to say, the whole truth, and so forth and so on. But the Romans were very relaxed about it. The Jews said, we can't swear on a graven image. And the Romans said, all right, don't do it. They were very relaxed about these things. They didn't force anything on anybody in the way of belief. They forced you to obey their laws and pay their taxes and do all the practical things that you do when you run an empire. They never thought that there was one God, and it was their duty to impose him on everybody, no matter how much people hated him. That was very un-Roman, and that's why they lasted 500 years. And the British Empire barely made it 150 years, and I think our days are numbered as well.
I think I've just got one more for Julian, which is just how was the book received, and were you criticized for being anti-Christian?
Well, Julian, when it came out, it was after my 10-year hiatus, in which I couldn't publish novels because I wasn't going to be reviewed in the Daily New York Times. That was their policy. They will try and deny it now, but just take a look. You'll see that they were not reviewed. 7 books. And I was blacked out. Luckily, I had England, where I was quite well received, and a lot of Europe. But I took 10 years off to do plays and movies and so on. Then I came back with Julian, and the reviews in America were pretty dull and mystified. Why is an American not writing about an American subject, which is marriage and divorce and oneself? Who's interested in this? We've never heard of it. See, again, it's the syndrome. If we don't already know it, it isn't worth knowing because we know everything. There was a bit of that. Curiously enough, the church, to the extent that they checked in at that time, since they've done quite a bit on the book, but Jesuits loved it, and it was required reading among Jesuits. And I got some very interesting reviews from them. Then, to the amazement of the publishers who had advised against, who on earth wants a novel about a 4th century emperor, it became #1 bestseller in the United States. And I saw to it that people would know that by printing the bestseller list with it as #1 in my memoirs. Because you say that and people say it's not true. The New York Times were not listed as that, but the Herald Tribune, which was the good newspaper then, did indeed note that it was #1. So it had a great audience from the beginning, or as great an audience as a novel could have in 1964. And I was back.
Deborah, did you have anything you wanted to anything you want to add?
Mm-hmm.
In the first paragraph of Messiah, Luther talks about memory, and I think we are all, betrayed by those eyes of memory. How are we betrayed by them?
Well, I did the same number even more explicitly at the beginning of Palimpsest, that memory is not only self-serving, but memory is subject to attrition, subject to time, subject to forgetfulness. Palimpsest, well, I picked it as a title for a memoir, is It's one bit of writing. It's a block, a printer's block, and they write on it. And then they write again on it, and they do impressions, and they write over it again. They write over it. And so you'll have 20 or 30 messages, one on top of the other, and they're hard to decipher, and some of them contradict others. And that, to me, is the way memory works. You can't really rely on it, but that's the best you can do. If you break your leg at the age of 10 and you want to think about it at the age of 40, you're not going to think. It isn't like pushing a button and getting an old tape. You push the button, but what you get is not the actual moment of breaking your leg when you were 10. What you get is the last time you remembered breaking your leg when you were 10. Well, you may have thought about it 500 times since you were 10 years old. Each time you think about it, you alter it. And each time you press the button to recall the breaking of the leg, you've lost more of it, and you've gained stuff that just wasn't there at all to begin with. That is the nature of memory. So Eugene Luther in Messiah is trying to recall a religion which became a world religion, with himself as the sort of Judas, the outcast. And it's a death cult that takes over the world. And he's writing in the near future, looking back over the origins of this cult, which started in America and turned into a death cult. A lot of it was stolen in a movie called Soylent Green, particularly the things where people go to commit suicide, and you go to these very nice places, and you lie down and you see beautiful pictures and newsreels and music, and you leave this world happily, presumably. And it was a quarry for other people's work. But it was a cult book at the time, and much read. It was the last of my first 7 or 8 books when I had to, it was 1954, and I had to quit, as I have described, for 10 years writing novels. So then from Messiah, and this man is remembering how this thing started, and it's a ghastly cult, basically, but it took the world by storm. It's a death cult. I was reading an interesting piece about it by some professor not long ago, saying that what gave it its strength was that it is a subtle parody of Christianity, which, of course, is a death cult writ large. What's the resurrection but emphasizing the nature of death, and maybe it can be overcome and maybe it cannot be. And so 10 years pass, and then with Julian I seem to have picked up where I left off, but go further back in time.
It'd be fun just to talk about some of the real life parallels to Cave's Way.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are plenty of them. John Cave, who is he comes from state of Washington, and his message, remember this was written back in the early 50s, his message is that death is no thing, and nothing is neither bad nor good, but nothing. And this is to remove people's fear of death. Well, he's a hypnotic TV performer, and I was the first one to invent that somebody could turn himself into a messiah through using television. And he has this sort of hypnotic effect on audiences, and he gets more and more worshippers. And then the plot requires at one point that he kill himself to prove that death is no thing, and he doesn't want to kill himself. So they have to shoot him off stage, as it were, to prove that he had taken what he called Cave's Way. And so he is dead, and he is now celebrated as the person who has become nothing. And now it's all right for everybody to do it. A lot of people start doing it. The world is overcrowded, not a pleasant place to live in, and many people go to these things. They were beautifully done in the movie Soylent Green, I thought. Edward G. Robinson goes into this wonderful place and lies on a stretcher, and they have broad screen of birds singing and all sorts of things that you can't see in the late modern world that he inhabits. And the story is told by the one man who's part of founding it and then realizes that it is a death cult and that it is anti-life and that it is bad. But he vanishes into Egypt, which is what the Islamic world is the last to be converted. And he's still safe. And then suddenly a couple of strangers arrive in Luxor, where he's living. And they want to find Eugene Luther, and he's terrified that they've come to kill him, because he's the last person who knows what the real story was. And so he gets to talk to this one man, find out what has been happening, and then he gradually figures out that the guy isn't really interested in him. And then they have a sort of the testament of John Cave. And he asks to look at it, and he looks it up. And his name is not in it. He has been erased. And then at the very end, he says that now that his life is over, and now that he's been erased from a religion that he'd helped create, he said, it is only now that I realize that I was he whom the world awaited and did not act. Well, this was pretty advanced in the early 50s to say that you could set up a religion on television. Then we saw what the Pat Robinsons and Jerry Falwells and Oral Robertses could do, and Dr. Sun Moon and the Scientologists. Suddenly there are religions all over the place now, thanks to the ubiquitousness of television.
Messiah, what does Gene Luther consider to be the one monster that the human race will never conquer?
I don't know. What was it?
Boredom. I thought that was great.
Oh. I don't know, apropos of what, I'd have to know how he comes into that and at what stage. That sounds like Eugene Luther at an early stage. His anxiety hovers over the last half of his life. But he does have one insight, because at first he does approve of the death cult of Cave's Way, John Cave. And he felt that one of the triggers would be something that the human race, in his view, could never overcome, and that is boredom. There isn't enough for most people to do in the course of a life, and for many people there isn't anything to do except the most boring, repetitive acts. And he felt he was not as mystical as John Cave about no thing cannot be bad. But he felt that boredom would lead many people to get out of a world in which there really was nothing much for them to do. And if they weren't afraid of what happens after you're dead, it'd just be, good riddance, go away. You don't like it here, you won't be missed. Right after Duluth was published, I was staying near Windsor with Princess Margaret and a small house party for 4 or 5 days. And she likes to sit up all night. And we were sitting up all night. There were about 4 or 5 of us still left. And she started to read aloud from Duluth. And she and I were both paralyzed with laughter, and I'm afraid these very correct Brits didn't know what on earth we were laughing about. And at the end of it, she said, I don't know what there is so low and vile in me that loves this book. I said, well, because it's funny.
This is just a fun thing, but what do you think would happen if Lieutenant Darby Darlene X, is it X or X? What are your
X.
X met Myra at a cocktail party.
I don't. If Darlene X were to meet Myra Breckenridge, well, it would be two great forces of creation. I think it would be rather similar to whatever it was that met the Earth that created the Moon. Some big chunk of something would fly off. I'm sure of that. Darlene, of course, is more of a pussycat, but equally strong-willed. And Myra, I think Myra would be pretty hostile, because Darlene, I never make it very clear, but although her uniform as a member of the Duluth Police Department homicide is made by Mambochet, or Maine Butcher, as he used to be called, and is theoretically chic, Darlene is not well-groomed. Now, Myra it's her one severity. You must be extremely well-groomed at all times. And she would probably want to remake Darlene into possibly Betty Grable, who was the obsession of Cloris Craig, another figure in Duluth. In fact, Cloris Craig is writing the life of Betty Grable. And she's got on to a fact that nobody knows, that Betty Grable was murdered because of her affair. But Darlene can't remember, Cloris Craig cannot remember whether she was having an affair with J. Edgar Hoover or Herbert Hoover. And until she untangles this, she's just hung up. I don't think Myra would be sympathetic to this.
There are just a few things, that I wanted to cover briefly. One was to talk a little bit about the 10 years in which you were writing for television and for the screen.
Well, in 1954, my last novel of the first period of my life, which was, I think, the 7th, Messiah Fell Dead, unreviewed and unnoticed, though it had its admirers and did very well in England. But by then I had to make a living, and I had this house up the Hudson, which was expensive to run, and television had just happened, television drama. So I had a wonderful agent called Franklin, and at the William Morris office. And I said, I think I want to write for television. I'd never written a play, really. And I said, just get me a couple scripts. So he got me 2 scripts, and I borrowed a television set and watched a TV live play. And then I sat down and I wrote one about a woman who was 2 people, called Dark Possession. And I gave it to Harold Franklin, who sold it to Studio One at CBS. The producer was Felix Jackson, who was married to a movie star called Deanna Durbin. And there was a wonderful woman called Florence Britton, who had been an actress, who was the script editor. And they liked it, and I was paid $750 for an hour drama, starring Geraldine Fitzgerald, Leslie Nielsen, who was a young man then from Canada. And it, well, you never knew with television, it did well in that people seemed to like it and the ratings were good. So I was off and running. I wrote another one, and another one, and another one. And within a year, I had got an offer from MGM to be what turned out to be the last contract writer. Well, by then I was doing so well with television, I didn't take that job for money. I wanted to see a great studio, because we all knew the studios were coming to an end. And I wanted to be at MGM, which was the studio. So there I was, and you had, if you were a contract writer, you worked generally with the same producer. And I was lucky in having Sam Zimbalist, who was a wonderful man. And the first picture I did with him was The Catered Affair with Betty Davis. Second one was Jose Ferrer, I Accuse, about the Dreyfus case. And then I really wanted to I'd seen quite enough of it, and I was very fond of him, and he asked me about 10 times, would I do Ben-Hur? And I said, well, I didn't like the first movie. I couldn't really read the book. And I said, no. Well, finally, they were desperate. And he said, will you come to Rome for 1 month? Only 1 month, and I'll rewrite your contract so that you don't owe us 5 more years or whatever it was. If you just come for the month of May and work on the script, we'll let you out. So that's what happened. I came to Rome. And I wrote everything up to the chariot race pretty much. Poor Charlton Heston is busy saying I didn't write anything. He's told so many lies about this. I think he's a little worried that I might sue him for libel. But currently he is quiet. So that picture was made. Christopher Fry wrote the last half. Neither of us got credit. That's the way the Writers Guild works. An ex-officer of the company, of the guild, got credit. I didn't much mind at the time because I didn't think much of the movie. Then I went back to, I still was doing occasionally television, and a TV play that I had done in 55, 56. I turned into a play for Broadway called Visit to a Small Planet, and that was very successful and became a very bad movie with Jerry Lewis. I had been told it was to be David Niven and found out too late that it had been secretly bought for Mr. Lewis. I never saw it, but I have read it. Then I had also done with Paul Newman on Philco Goodyear Playhouse, The Death of Billy the Kid. And Newman was under contract to Warner's, and we went into Warner's and got them to take it. And that became The Left-Handed Gun, which was another mess. Due to the producer, changing directors, everything that could go wrong went wrong. Never saw that one either. That was disappointing because that was my first attempt to do my own movie. I wanted to produce them and write them. I didn't want to be a director. And this was my opportunity, and I've had several opportunities, but something generally went wrong. Due mainly to management, the more money they pay you, the less power you're going to have. That's a law of films. I then went on, did another play, The Best Man, 1960, and ran for Congress that year. So I was somewhat returned to politics. My friend Kennedy was running for president. I was happy in my district, upstate New York, that I got something like 44% of the vote, which is almost double what the last congressional candidate got, and Jack only got about 35% of the vote, somewhat less than my vote. I was very pleased with that, and he was not very pleased with that. Then within that 10 years, I did several other movies. I did Suddenly Last Summer. Is Paris Burning? I guess that was later. Then by 62 or 3, I decided if I stayed in the house upstate New York, I was going to be a full-time politician. And I wanted to go back to novel writing, and I wanted to go back to Julian. So I decided to go to Rome to have the American Academy Library at my disposal. And that's what happened. Howard and I moved to Rome in 62, 63. And Julian was published in 64, and from that time on I was a novelist, occasionally going back to do the odd movie, to write the odd movie, to do 4 more plays on Broadway. But mainly I had returned to the novel. And during the 10 years that I was away, just to keep my hand in, dramatic writing is not prose. It's just a total different set of muscles. To keep my hand in prose, I had become an essayist. I didn't have the time to write a novel, but I had time I could do shorter pieces. So I set myself up as an essayist as well as a dramatist during that decade. So it was a happy decade, though I would probably have been happier had I been allowed by the censors of my country to be a novelist.
Let's talk a little bit about some friends and some enemies. Who have been your closest friends? Who would you consider your closest friends in your life?
You see, most people go through life, is so-and-so my friend or my enemy? Or do I like so-and-so? Or so-and-so like me? My brain has never worked like that. It works like this. Is so-and-so's company interesting enough for me to be with her or him? And it'll be intellectually or sexually or something, but is it sufficiently interesting? I don't go in for the love thing. I don't go in for liking. Obviously, if I like someone's company, I will seek out their company. If I don't like their company, they can be as noble can be, and I'm not going to be around. Most people suffer from, I'm not loved. People don't love me for myself. They love me for my money or for my fame or this or that. I suffer from none of these things. I don't care what they think about me. I care what I think about them. I love the company of Christopher Isherwood. He could get on my nerves, and there were aspects of him I didn't like, but then there were aspects of me that he didn't like. So these things are generally mutual. Tennessee Williams was the person I most liked traveling with and most enjoyed his company. And, of course, he was a master playwright, and I learned playwriting by watching him write plays. And I'd go out of town with things like Summer and Smoke, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. I remember I was there the night that Stalin died. And I had been to see the play out of town, and then the first thing is a headline, Stalin is dead. I learned a lot by just enjoying his company and picking up about the theater from him. So you can't say Anais Nin had a great influence on me when I was still in the army at 18, 19, 20. By 21, it had pretty much faded away. I saw that she was in many ways exactly what I most disliked on earth, which was self-absorption, vanity, and full of odd quirks. She believed in astrology. She believed in Reichian analysis. She was a kind of anthology of what would later be called New Age cliches, and that was not for me. And other friends were just, there was a lot of good company around upstate New York. We had F.W. Dupee, the critic and professor at Columbia. He was a great influence on me, particularly on the essays. In fact, he was the one who egged me on and got me to Partisan Review. And then we were all part of the original New York Review of Books. We were all in the first issue, and that was the beginning of a long career as an essayist. It's people like that. I can't think of anything of a romantic or very interesting nature. And why they interested me was largely because they were very intelligent.
So can you tell me when you and Howard met and became
We met in 1950, just before my 25th birthday. And a party was given at Cafe Nicholson, and he went to the party. And that is, 51 years ago.
What city are you talking about?
I first met Howard Austin in 1950, 52 years ago. And I remember shortly before my 25th birthday, and he's about 4 years younger than I am. And here we are in Ravello. Before that, we were in New York and upstate New York at Edgewater.
You must find him, when you talk about friendship, the important element being someone who interests you and whose company interests you. Is that what you think keeps you together?
I would suppose so, yes.
I wanted to just go back in Palimpsest, you wrote about Jimmy Trimble as being your soulmate in the Platonic sense. Could you tell me about that? I know you talked a little bit the other day about what one had, that your different qualities making. If you could just.
Well, I was saying of Jimmy Trimble, he was the other self. What he was, I was not. What I was, he was not. So we complemented each other. And that's the Platonic essence aspect of it. The relationship was not, strictly speaking, Platonic. That's another thing. And that is sort of what happens at the beginning of life. Your first attachment of any great strengths leaves a mark, leaves a profound impression, which time erases, and it might never have come back to me as vividly if I hadn't written Palimpsest and was forced myself to relive those days. It was not a childhood that I particularly wanted to recall, or youth, indeed. It wasn't until I was about 25 that I got free of all sorts of complications in my life, of a family and other natures. So my first 25 years I would probably have forgotten by now. But recollecting Jimmy, then that reminded me of a great many things that I was very happy to remember, and began to weigh it and began to see it in a new light. Hence, a palimpsest emerged with a message quite different from what I thought was there.
Can you tell me about the choosing the spot at Rock Creek where you want to be buried, and halfway between Henry Adams and Jimmy Trimble, and then what's become of it now?
Well, we were looking about for places to be planted after death, and I thought I'd always liked Rock Creek Cemetery. It's one of the most beautiful places in Washington. And it's where all my family and friends ended up, quite a number of them. And so I went there to see what they had in the way of plots, and figured out we had a perfectly modest plot with a slab of marble with my name and dates and Howard's name and dates, and there will only be ashes under it. And then I noted that it's on a sort of hill, and I was drawn to the hill because it's where Henry Adams and presumably Clover, his wife who killed herself, they won't tell you where they're buried, but they're somewhere on this hill. And Henry Adams put up this beautiful marble bench, semicircle, with a statue, which is generally called the Statue of Grief. You can't tell whether it's a young man or a young woman because he or she is wearing a kind of caul over the head, like a shawl. Although Henry Adams irritably said when Theodore Roosevelt asked him was it a man or a woman, and he says, of course it's a young man. And a sculptor friend of his had done it. Anyway, it's the most beautiful section of Rock Creek. You sit there and surrounded by flowering trees. And Eleanor Roosevelt told me that whenever things were really going bad for her, she would drive out to Rock Creek and sit in that bench and contemplate the image of grief. And I thought, well, this fits in with my life work and the people that I have known, from Eleanor Roosevelt to, and then, of course, I realized Jimmy Trimble was there. And almost erased. It's very hard to find his stone. Maybe easier now. His mother has since died. And I'm told people come there. They put the stone down now. They shouldn't have done that. They should have waited till we were dead. But I guess Rock Creek Cemetery was perhaps advertising. So there it is. And George McGovern was up there burying his daughter, and he and Eleanor, Mrs. McGovern, are going to be buried there too. He said, well, I went over to see your attraction, and there you are. The people were coming to look at your grave. And I said, well, it's a fake. We're not in it yet. But
it's a very bizarre image.
mm-hmm.
You also wrote about living in Ravello, and you said that you, first of all, that you don't want very much anymore, and that you live in the present, and that you like letting go. Could you tell me about that?
Well, I have no particular ambitions anymore that need to be accomplished, or I feel need to be accomplished. I read and I write, which is all that I've ever done anyway, except occasionally I've been active politically. So Ravello is a perfect place in which to both read and write, and that is what I do. And I have no great demands upon the world. I trust the world has no great demands upon me. So it is a serene place to survey the past, one's own and that of one's country. And the Italians are, at least the ones around here, are very good at leaving you alone. And it's very, it's the new cliche word for what we're all looking for, the human race is looking for, community. And of course all the people who talk so bravely about community are all trying to get into the Trump Tower in New York and go to parties. Well, I don't want to go to parties, and I don't want to be in the Trump Tower. And I have achieved community here. It is not necessarily the community of Isherwood, Williams, F.W. Dupee, but as I once wrote, to the horror of millions of people, if you've known one person, you've known them all.
Interesting. All right, very briefly, could you tell me about your 1968 encounter with Buckley at the time of the Chicago, the convention in Chicago?
Well, there's nothing much to tell. ABC wanted something different. And they decided to speak for the liberals, there'd be me, and to speak for the conservatives, there would be Buckley. I had got him onto television by making the mistake of referring to him on the Jack Barr show. He had written that Pope John XXIII's message to the world was an essay in triviality. And I said, the right wing in America doesn't even understand what conservatism is. And fortunately, I used his name. He rang up immediately and got himself on the Jack Barr show, and that's the beginning of Buckley on television. So no bad deed goes unpunished, too. And then we were sort of officially the left wing and the right wing, which is a total misnomer. I don't identify myself as left wing, and he is no conservative. He's a radical. But I debated when they asked, would we do, I think, 6 or 8 shows together. First batch at the Republican convention in Miami Beach, and the second one in Chicago, the Democratic convention. And I saw the danger. I will look like the same sort of nut on the left that he is a nut on the right. And, you know, I find him grotesque, and I think many people do. Well, once you're paired with somebody like that, the grotesquerie rubs off. And I was dubious about it. But finally I was talked into it. If I didn't do it, somebody else would, and maybe I would do it better than some alternative. So we did it, and we seldom spoke to each other. And after the blow-up in Chicago, we never spoke again. And I don't regret it at all. I think it was the first time ABC ever got to be #1 in prime time. And we did it. We were on for 15 minutes live, and we wouldn't know until a few minutes before we went on air what we were going to talk about. And Howard K. Smith, who was our interlocutor, very pro-Buckley, may I say, would say, all right, boys, we're going to talk about the vice president. Mr. Vidal, you go first. And you just start talking. And it was quite paralyzing if you thought about it, that 20 million people are watching you live, and you're quite unprepared, except what you can just wing. But we got through it. Well, 1968 was a crucial year politically, and everybody knew there was going to be a lot of fireworks. At the Republican convention and at the Democratic convention. At the Republican convention, I think I was the first person to predict that not only was Richard Nixon coming back, but he was going to be nominated and he was going to win. The Democrats were in a great mess. Bobby Kennedy had been killed. I think Martin Luther King had been killed. Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson wasn't running. His vice president, Hubert Humphrey, was to be his heir. But we had all supported Eugene McCarthy, who had been against the Vietnam War. So it was a poisonous atmosphere. And into this came the Vidal-Buckley debates, which were relatively poisonous too, and got more so in Chicago, when the Chicago police rioted, and they turned on the delegates, they turned on the press. I got tear-gassed in Grant Park. You really saw how easily the country could come unstuck. It was a great moment. I remember I was down on the floor of the convention, and there, standing on a chair, was Mayor Daley, and Abe Ribicoff, the senator from Connecticut, had got up and proposed to the convention that because of the police riots, that the convention dissolve itself and go to another city. And there is Mayor Daley screaming, "Sheeny, go home! Sheeny, go home!" It was that sort of convention.
You had said that you wouldn't consider yourself, by that tag as a leftist. How would you describe?
Well, I'm not in the business of self-description. Read me and you'll find out where I stand on things. I'm anti-imperial, and most of the country is pro-imperial. I believe that the $7 trillion that we spent since 1950 on the empire would have been better spent educating the people and giving them a health service. If that's left-wing, then I'm left-wing. If that is intelligent, as I think it is, well, that's intelligent. And if to spend it on war when we have no enemy except what we create from time to time, that's stupid. And if it's stupid, one ought not to be stupid.
You said that you did a lot of live television talk shows.
Mm-hmm.
And why did you do that?
I did a lot of live TV shows. First of all, I was running for Congress as a 59, and I was the leader of the 5, Democratic leader of the 5 counties upstate, mid-Hudson Valley. So I wasn't going to run with a lot of money, so I had to make myself known to the district, which I did on national television. And I was constantly on Jack Parr and later Johnny Carson and Merv Griffin and so on, and David Susskind. I used to do at least once a year State of the Union. And I would get up as the shadow president, and I would take up the subjects that the president was actually talking about, and then I would give another interpretation, often opposite to what he was saying. And this proved to be a popular feature for a dozen years. I did television in order to get my views across to the public. The New York Times is not going to print them. Time magazine isn't going to print them. You're blacked out if you say anything that goes against what they believe and what they want people to think. However, in those days, there was so much live television, and it was quite free. And if you could hold an audience and people would listen, you were in great demand. I was told once by the Tonight Show, they said, I said, how does this thing work? There are times I want to go on, you say, no, we can't book you. There are times I don't want to go on. They say, for God's sake, you've got to be here Monday night and so on. I said, how does it work? He said, well, don't tell anybody. But when you are on, our ratings go up in every city in the United States. We lose the entire South, and except for Chicago, most of the Midwest. Now, if our ratings have been good in the cities, we don't need you. But if there's sinking a bit in the cities, we do need you, and we don't care that much about. That's more important to us than the South and the parts of the Midwest. That's how it works. Now, it's still true, but they won't have me on at all. They would rather lose money than hear a voice say things that they don't want heard. They are true believers now. It's like a religion, and they're peddling a religion on television. And only if certain things are true and everything else is untrue. And anyone who says to the contrary must not be allowed on. That, I fear, is what it's come to.
After World War II, you wrote your first, well, it wasn't your first novel, but the first one that was published and widely recognized.
Mm-hmm.
And there were other writers like Norman Mailer and you described it as a kind of golden age, or what you thought was going to be a golden age in literature. Could you just describe that time and who were your compatriot writers?
Well, I've often said that the post-war period, we had 5 years, 45 to 50, which were the only 5 years that we were not at war with somebody, hot, cold, tepid. In those 5 years, there was an explosion in all of the arts. We became number one in ballet, of all things, something nobody had known about before the war. Suddenly there's ballet theater and Anthony Tudor, Jerry Robbins. In music, we had Lenny Bernstein, Copland. We were taking off in all the arts. In the novel, there was Mailer and Capote, Paul Bowles. McCullers, myself, there were at least 20 very interesting writers in that 5-year period who just emerged from nowhere, and wonderful poets. It was the beginning of Robert Lowell, Elizabeth Bishop. The theater, one night you went to see Streetcar Named Desire, the next night you'd go to see Death of a Salesman. All of the arts, there was just a burst of energy because we had been at war, and before that, depression, for the better part of a generation. But our rulers did not want us to be at peace. And Harry Truman, in 1950, militarized the American economy. He brought the draft back in peacetime, something that never happened in America before. We had no enemy. We pretended the Russians were coming, but they weren't going anywhere, and we knew that. He installed loyalty oaths for everybody working in government and everybody in universities, everybody teachers. it was like the Soviet Union, and we were imitating the Soviet Union. The CIA was an imitation of the KGB. Suddenly, and the loyalty oaths led immediately to Senator McCarthy. It was Truman that started that scare, not Joe McCarthy. He just exploited it. So one watched with horror from 50 to through the Korean War to the United States becoming a garrison state, constantly armed, with no interest in the arts, nothing but terror propaganda. School teachers denied their jobs. William Buckley and family rushing around to say, this teacher's a communist, that teacher a communist, they must be fired, they must be fired. They're teaching communism. It was a reign of terror. We all know about the blacklisted writers. Everybody goes, ho, 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 who cares about screenwriters? They're not important. Well, they lost their livelihoods, and we lost a lot of good movies. It was a reign of terror, and it went on and on and on. And ever since 1950, we have been at war with somebody, somewhere. The enemy of the month club. If it isn't Noriega, it's Gaddafi. If it's not Gaddafi, it's Saddam Hussein. If it's not that, it's North Korea. If it's not that, it's terrorism now, terrorism. That poor man who went to Harvard is now blowing up Afghanistan or something. We are constantly lied to, constantly propagandized, and alternative voices are not allowed on the media where they can be effective. Yes, you can write a piece in The Nation with 100,000 circulation, but the New York Times will not notice it. I don't think I've seen Noam Chomsky even mentioned in that paper outside of linguistics, and his is a great voice for truth.
There was a point at which your relationship with Norman Mailer, which had been pretty affable, became strained after he attacked the feminists. And could you just...
Well, Mailer and I have always had perfectly friendly relations, but nothing more. And he wrote an attack on a book called The Prisoner of Sex, an attack on the feminists, and I responded because I thought he was all wrong, and he got very upset. And there was a lot of fuss in the press, and that was that. There's nothing more to it. Uninteresting story, in my view.